Hello, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Josh. I work with our students. Right now, our church is going through a series called At the Movies. And what's happening is we're taking modern day movies or modern day parables and we are pulling spiritual truths out of them. But because we're actually using real Hollywood blockbuster movies, we don't have the right to stream those online. So if you want to experience At the Movies, we would love to have you, but you have to be here in person. So you can come every Sunday, either 9 or 10:50. We have childcare in both services. We'd love to have you. If for everybody else, what we're doing online during At the Movies is I'm kind of taking you on a long journey. We're doing a 5-part series, and what I'm doing is really kind of telling you the story of the Bible, the story of the world. And we're going basically from Genesis through the end of the book, and we are going to just unveil and tell the story as God reveals himself. And so we're actually in week 3. And so week 1, we kind of took this big 30,000-foot view. We talked about creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and kind of just gave a general overview and understanding of the Bible. And then last week, we spent like 45 minutes literally walking through the book of Genesis, and we were tracing how God relates to people and how he makes all these promises to Abraham in Genesis 12, 15, and 17, and how he carries those promises along and how his covenant passes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Judah to Perez. Like we trace that. And so if you missed that, there's a lot of information there. And some of those themes from Genesis are going to come back up today. And then for sure, some of those themes will come back up by the time we get to week 5 and we really tie it all together and really connect all the dots. So if you have the time, I would love for you to go back and check out last week's, the first 2 weeks. For us today, we're in week 3, okay? Like I said, this is not a typical sermon that you would hear on a Sunday morning. This is much more a Sunday school class or an in-depth Bible study. This is very similar to a class that I had in Bible college. And so if you're following along online, I'm going to send you some resources. So if you go to colonialhill.org, or no, colonialhill.carrd.co. Again, that's not a typo. There are 2 R's, colonialhill.carrd.co. That is going to bring up this page right here. We are in week 3, so week 3 handout is this right here. In week 3, this week should be a little shorter, but everything, all the scriptures that I refer to are on here, but also all the stuff that's on the screen is on these pages. That might help you follow along and just kind of retain. It really is kind of drinking like from a fire hydrant. It's just a massive amount of information. We're also going to be looking at the tabernacle today. And so if you click this one right here, week 3 tabernacle, that's going to pull up a picture of the tabernacle. And we're going to refer to that in a little bit later. So you might want to have that in front of you as well. So again, the website is colonialhill.carrd.co. Love for you to pull that up and to have those resources handy so that you can follow along. Okay? So we are now at the book of Exodus, okay? We've kind of talked through the book of Genesis, all of God's people there. There's about 70 people. Genesis really dealt with how is God going to relate to us, and the answer is through a covenant. And there's going to be some themes that are reiterated, like the land, the seed, the blessing. Those just come up over and over and over. And so we saw those promises of God pass, and then Genesis closes, and now you come to the book of Exodus. The reason why Exodus is written is a little different from the reason why Genesis was written. So Genesis is asking the question of how God relates to us. Exodus is asking the question of how do we approach God? How do we, as a sinful people, how do we come into the presence of God? Exodus helps us a ton with that. And so, from the close of Genesis to the opening of the Exodus has been 400 years. And in that time, like Joseph and all those guys we saw last week, they have passed. And now the Egyptians, like it's a different Pharaoh, it's a different group of people, and they hate the Israelites. They hate God's people. But not only that, God's people have multiplied like crazy. And as they have multiplied, the Egyptians decided to take them into captivity, and the Israelites are in forced, manual, harsh slave labor. So every single day, 365 days a year, they have this manual slave labor. They have no hope of a future. They have no hope of a holiday or a vacation. They have no hope of a day off. It is the same thing every day. There's this harsh slave labor, and then God's people begin to cry out to God, asking him to deliver them out of this slave labor, and God listens, and he's going to raise up, and we're going to be introduced to a man named Moses. Now, Moses was supposed to be killed by the order of Pharaoh because all the Israelite boys are supposed to be killed upon birth because they're trying to get the population of the Israelites down. What Moses' mom does is she has the baby and then she hides him. And about 3 months in, she can't hide him anymore. I guess he's too fussy or he's too squirmy. And so it becomes dangerous. She literally puts him in a basket in the Nile and she pushes it out, which had to be devastating for her to do. But as he floats, Pharaoh's daughter sees Moses, she has compassion on him, and she literally adopts him into her family. In the first 40 years of Moses' life, he spends that in the court of Pharaoh, in the palace. He has the best food, the best education, the most luxuries that were possible at that time. And that's his first 40 years. When he's about 40, he goes out into the city and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He knows he's a Hebrew, right? He knows he's adopted, but he's living the Egyptian life. He goes out, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he tries to stop it. He ends up killing the Hebrew, or the Egyptian. Then he buries the Egyptian and leaves, thinking he got away with it and that nobody will know. And the next day, he goes back out, and these guys are fighting. He breaks it. 2 Hebrews are fighting. He breaks it up, and they said, "Hey, are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Moses freaks out, and rightfully so. He freaks out, and then he flees to Midian, and he's there for the next 40 years. So the first 40 years in the palace, the second 40 years of his life, he's literally out in the wilderness. He becomes like a shepherd. He's tending sheep. He gets married. He has kids, and he's doing perfectly fine until one day he sees this burning bush. And it's not just that the bush is burning, it's that the bush is burning and it is not burned up. And so he goes and says, "I'm going to go check out and see what's happening with that." As Moses walks up to that bush, God literally speaks out of the bush and says, "Moses, take off your shoes, for the ground you are standing on is holy." And God basically says, "Hey, Moses, I've chosen you. I've called you. You're going to go back to Egypt. You're going to command Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the world. You're going to command him to let my people, the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, you're going to command him to let my people go." And what Exodus 3 and 4 records, it's in your handout, but just to be real quick, basically it records Moses hearing what God says, and then Moses giving God 5 excuses as to why God has got the wrong guy. And it's everything from, "Who am I?" God says, "I will be with you." Moses says, "Well, what's your name?" When I go and tell the Israelites, "Okay, this guy spoke to me out of a bush," what do I tell him that your name is? And he says, "Tell them that I am who I am," which has all kinds of depth and beauty to it. And then the third excuse, Moses says, "Well, what if they don't listen to me?" And then God gives Moses these 2 signs. The one is when Moses throws his staff down, it becomes a snake. The second, he puts his hand inside his cloak and brings out and has leprosy. He puts his hand back in, it comes out, and it's perfectly healed. God says, "Show them those signs, and then they will believe you." And then the fourth excuse, Moses says, "I'm not eloquent." Moses apparently had a stutter, which is pretty fascinating that he's one of the most significant rulers in the history of the world, and the history of the Israelites for sure, and he might not have been able to actually hold a basic conversation very well. He had some kind of a speech impediment, and he says, "God, I'm not eloquent." God says, "Hey, I'm going to help you speak. I'm going to help you." And then finally, Moses, he just says, "God, could you send somebody else?" And I just feel like I relate to that so much. Like he says, "Just send somebody else." And God kind of gets frustrated, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to give you your brother Moses, and he's going to help you." And so Moses finally gives in. He heads back to Egypt. He meets with all the elders and says, "Hey, this is what God said to me. This is what happened. God appeared to me." Moses shows them the signs. The elders are on board. Moses and Aaron go into Pharaoh, and Moses basically says, "Pharaoh, let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "No." And not only am I saying no, but you people have too much time on your hands. So now you not only have to make bricks, but you have to gather your own straw. Because before, the Egyptians would gather the straw, and the Israelites would mix it and make the bricks and do all the work. And now Pharaoh's saying, you got too much time on your hands. Now, not only do you have to make the same amount of bricks, but you also have to gather the straw. And God's people are just kind of upset. They're crying out. Moses is going to go back to Pharaoh and say, "Hey, let my people go." Pharaoh's going to say no. The plagues are going to begin. And that's kind of the process. Moses says, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. A plague comes. Pharaoh's going to call Moses in to stop the plague. Moses is going to stop the plague. Pharaoh's not going to let the people go. And this is going to happen over and over and over 10 times. The plagues are this. The Nile turns to blood. There's a plague of frogs, plague of gnats, plague of flies, plague of the death of the livestock, plague of boils, plague of hail, plague of locusts, plague of darkness. And the last one is the death of the firstborn. Now, what you have to understand about the plagues is that literally devastated the Egyptian economy. In every way, their ability, like their crops are gone, their livestock is gone. Like it literally wipes out everything and makes them like from the wealthiest nation in the world, and it literally devastates their land. And the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn, and that's found in Exodus 11 and 12, and it's super significant because the firstborn is going to die, but the night before it happens, God is going to introduce the Passover. And the Passover is the meal that is going to be celebrated every year from here on out. And it's the same meal that Jesus is eating with his disciples the night before he dies. And so there's tons of significance here, tons of imagery, tons of foreshadow. But the beauty is that God puts all these instructions for the Passover meal. He's like, you're going to do all these certain things. You're going to eat these certain things. There's going to be a certain order to the meal. There's going to be certain ingredients that you use and don't use. And God puts all these instructions in place. And that first night, one thing they had to do was slaughter an innocent lamb, and they had to take the blood from the lamb, and they had to wipe it over the doorpost of their homes. And what happens is that night, as the death angel is passing throughout the country, killing the firstborn, if there is the blood of the innocent lamb over the doorpost, the death angel would see that, and it would pass over that house. That's why it's called the Passover. But again, just tying this full circle to what we've already discussed in previous weeks, you have an innocent lamb dying, its blood being smeared and covering the guilty, right? And because the guilty is covered, the death angel passes over them. The innocent dies to cover, just like the innocent died to cover Adam and Eve all the way back in Genesis 3. Listen to Exodus 12. It says, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go. Also, bless me. And the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. And so that first Passover night, all across Egypt, there's death. And literally that forces, like Pharaoh's like, y'all leave. The Egyptians are like, y'all leave. Y'all get out of here. And what happens is God's people are going to walk out of Egypt, and God is going to lead them. He's going to lead them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They have all the possessions that they have, men, women, children, old people, young people, all of their animals, everything. And some scholars estimate you're talking over 1 million people at this moment, literally walking out of Egypt, going as God directs them. And through the course of the story, God's going to lead them over a couple days up to the Red Sea. And when you study the passage of the Red Sea, on one side there's mountains, on another side there's a desert. If they go forward, it's the sea. And then they realize if they turn around and go backwards, that now Pharaoh's army is coming back to try to bring them back after they let them go. And so there's this moment at the Red Sea where people are panicking, and then Moses strikes the sea, and God does this miraculous thing that he literally parts the sea, and God's people walk through the Red Sea on dry ground. Everybody gets across safely. As the Egyptians try to follow, the walls crash down, and again, another devastation to the nation of Israel. Their army is utterly devastated. And that's how God delivers and redeems his people out of Egypt. That's how he institutes the Passover, and that's the story of the Red Sea. Now God's people are in this wilderness, and they're heading to the land that he has promised. They're headed to the promised land, the land that God promised all the way back in Genesis 12 to Abraham. He said, I'm going to give you this land. He's talking about the promised land. So God's people are now out of Egypt, and they're walking toward the promised land. This is kind of the wilderness time. And the wilderness time is super formative, and it tells us a lot about ourselves, because as much as you want to make fun of the Israelites for how they acted, like we would do the same thing. So like one day God literally parts the Red Sea, they literally walk through the miracle. Like they walk through it, they walk through the miracle. But 3 days later, when you have men, women, children, all your possessions, all your animals, you're making this slow headway. But when you run out of food and you run out of water and you have all this assembly of people with you, they begin to grumble. And you think, oh my gosh, in just 3 days, they're crying and they're complaining. But you have to understand, we would have done the exact same thing. When you really don't have food, you don't have water, you can't really see how it's going to work out. Like when that's your reality, like it's easy for us to grumble. It doesn't matter if 3 days ago God did something miraculous. Like right now, we're hungry, we're thirsty, we're tired, we're exhausted, we're uncomfortable, we're displaced. Like you have to put yourself in their shoes. And I think we would have acted exactly the way they did. And so God, even though he's leading them by the cloud by day and the fire by night, and when he moves, they follow, like God's obviously there, but there's a lot of inconvenience. And so you have stories like in Exodus 17 where they're complaining and Moses strikes the rock and this water comes out. It's one of the major stories in this time period. But what you really see, even though I think we would act the same way that they did, what you really see in this kind of wilderness time is this theme of God's people not really trusting God. They're really struggling. When things don't go their way, they really don't trust God, right? Like they really don't trust him. They really don't obey him. They're rebelling against Moses every other day. They're doubting God. Like these stories come up often in this wilderness time. If you read Numbers 13 and 14, again, it's just kind of the narrative of God's people in this time. Moses has led the people all the way up to the edge of the promised land. And, God's given them quail, God's giving them manna, God's given them miraculously, like the water. There's another one where the water's bitter and it turns not bitter. Like God's actively doing all these things, leads them all the way up to the promised land. They know God has promised them this land. They're literally at the edge looking out into it, and they're going to send spies into the land to spy it out. These spies are going to come back, and this is the report that they give. Numbers 13, 27 and 30 to 32. It says, they gave Moses this account. We went into the land which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. And they said, the land we explored devours those living in it. And all the people saw there of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in their own eyes. We look the same to them. It's like we know Genesis 12, 1 and 2, right? That God promised this land to us. But when we actually got to land, there's giants. Yes, it's a good land. Yes, the soil's good. Yes, the fruit is good. Yes, it's beautiful. But man, there's giants there. There's all these fortified cities. How could we, the Israelites, possibly attack that? Joshua and Caleb, two of the 12 spies are like, dude, let's go. But everybody else spreads this bad report. And as a result of that, because they doubted, God says basically you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And in that 40 years, everybody in that generation from 20 years old up, except for Caleb and Joshua, those men are going to die. And so, again, on the one hand, it's marked by complaining and negativity and not really trusting God. Because of that, they don't really get to enter that generation doesn't get to enter the promised land. But at the same time, that forces them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And in that 40 years, a lot of significance happens. God is going to actually give them the law. And in 2021, this idea of the law has a lot of negative connotations, but the law was good. Jesus said that the law was good. And what the law does is it kind of does three overarching things for God's people. It's going to guide them as a nation. It's going to guide them relationally with one another, and it's going to instruct them on how to approach the living God. It's going to teach them how to approach the living God. And so for our purposes, I want to zero in on that third aspect, like how we approach God, because that's one of our overarching questions. How does a sinful people like us approach a living God? How can God love us but still punish sin? Like, how can God deal with sin but not kill us? He can't brush it under the rug or he wouldn't be the just judge. But if he punishes us and the wages of sin is death, eternal separation, like what do we do? Like, how do we navigate this reality? God's law, and specifically the sacrificial system and the tabernacle, they help us understand what God demands and how we step into that, okay? So the law is going to show us how sinful we are because nobody can keep it. All these laws, everything that God lays out, the one thing that you see is that you can't perfectly keep the law. And so God gives this sacrificial system so that when we don't follow the law, we can do these sacrifices, do these things to be put back into a right place with God, to be purified or cleansed from our sin. And so the law gave instructions for the tabernacle, which later becomes the temple. This is on that website, you remember? This is that tabernacle handout, okay? And so this would be the entrance. There was the bronze altar and laver. This is the holy place. This is the Holy of Holies. I'm going to kind of briefly explain this real quick just so we can wrap our mind around it, okay? This is the, if you have this, it might help to keep that in front of you as I discuss these next few points, okay? So this was the tabernacle. It was portable. And so when it was first created, they could tear it down and follow God wherever he moves in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. As he left, they would tear down the tabernacle and follow him. Eventually, in King Solomon's day, he's going to build a permanent temple in Jerusalem. But you had the entrance here, and this would be the outer court, the courtyard. Pretty much anybody was allowed to at least be there and to watch, okay? And this is where the actual sacrifices would take place, where they would literally slaughter the lamb and do the different things that were instructed. This is the holy place. And in here is the altar of incense and the table of showbread and some other things. Only the Levites, the priests, could enter this, and they had different things that they had to do as God had prescribed. They had to basically keep this all going on the outer court and the holy place. This is the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And on the Ark of the Covenant is these two cherubims. It's these six-winged creatures. And their wings are like spread over the top of this, the lid to the Ark, which is called the Atonement cover or the mercy seat. And when the people finally finished the tabernacle, God's presence literally went and it rested on top of the ark between those cherubim on that mercy seat or on that atonement cover. And it was a significant thing. Only the high priest, one person, could go into the Holy of Holies, and he could only go into there one day a year. And that was the Day of Atonement. And that's written about in Leviticus 16. So outer court, inner court, Holy of Holies. Leviticus 16 explains the Day of Atonement. And so, you want to know something interesting? The word atonement is used over 50 times in the 27 chapters of Leviticus. Leviticus is teaching us this sacrificial system, and it's teaching us how to make atonement for our sin. And the reason why it's teaching us how to make atonement for sin is because when your sins are atoned for, that's how you can approach God. When your sin is paid for, that's how you can approach a holy and a just God. And so the Day of Atonement was one day a year. The high priest would, there's a lot of different rules. They had to bathe and put on these special clothes, and then they would sacrifice an innocent lamb first for himself to make atonement for himself and his household. And he had to take the blood and go into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle it on the ark. And then he would go back out. He had to take two goats after he made atonement for himself. He then had to go back out, do some other stuff, and get these other two goats because now he's making atonement for the whole nation. And he takes two goats and he presents them before the Lord at the entrance of the temple. He would cast lots over the goats, one lot for the Lord and one lot that would be a scapegoat. The one that the lot fell on, the high priest would take it, kill it, and sacrifice it before the Lord as a sin offering, and he would slaughter the goat in front of God's people, and then he would take that into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle it over the Ark of the Covenant to atone for the sins of the nations. But then he would go back out to the scapegoat, the other goat where the lot didn't fall, that goat would be there. He would lay his hands on the head of the goat. He would confess the sins of the Israelites over that goat. And after that, he would send that goat away into the wilderness, symbolizing the carrying away of their sins. And so that Day of Atonement was significant because only one person could go all the way into that Holy of Holies. It was literally curtained off from the rest. He was the one that got to go back there, and he was making these sacrifices for himself, yes, but also for the nation, which means he kind of acted as this mediator. He was the one that was mediating between God and the people, making atonement and making a payment for all of their sins so that they could worship God, so that they could approach God. And so only he could enter, and he had to do all these things to sacrifice for himself and for behalf of the people. They do this year after year to make atonement for their sins. Innocent lambs die in the place of the guilty. The blood covers their sins for another year, like the blood covered the doorpost in that first Passover. Every year there's this atonement where the blood covers the Israelite sin for that year. Their sins are also confessed over the scapegoat, and that scapegoat is sent into the wilderness, symbolizing the carrying away of their sins so that they're being cleansed and purified and made holy so that they can worship God. What we learn from the law is this: no one measures up. No one. We all fall short, and no one can perfectly keep the law. But when you think about the law, when you think about the sacrificial system, I think it's so hard for us to really grasp it, and it's very hard to read, and it's hard to really piece together everything that's happening. But what we need to understand is that is God in his grace and his mercy. What he's doing is he's making a way for us, God's people, to approach him. He's making a way for sin to be dealt with. He's making a way for us to be able to worship him. He wants us into his presence, but he's got to cleanse us and make us holy first. And so he's doing all these things so that we can be in his presence. It's really a deep and beautiful thing, and it's really full of grace. I think the more you study the Old Testament, and the more you appreciate the New Testament. The more you understand the Old Testament, the more you understand the New Testament. In the first 5 books of the Bible, we see so much evil and wickedness in humanity, but we also see this God who constantly is making a way and pursuing us so that we might be brought into a relationship with him. He connects to us in a covenant relationship. He always fulfills his promise. And even though we are sinful and we don't deserve it, he's going to redeem us out of our slavery. Even though we should be grateful, we tend to be critical and complain, but God is going to be merciful, and he's always going to provide more than enough. God's going to give us all that we need to know how to worship him and how to approach him. It's graphic and it's beautiful, but it's good. Like God is coming after us. And as we continue and keep going next week, all these ideas, like we're going to kind of finish out the New Testament. We're going to see a bunch of these ideas expand. And then when we get to week 5, we're going to put all this together, and we're going to connect all the dots. And I'm telling you, if you follow me through all 5 of these sermons, by the time you get to sermon number 5, man, I just think it creates so much worship and so much appreciation. And I think you see God in a much bigger way, and you see him just for the incredible worth that he is. Like, I think if you listen to all these sermons and then you hear the 5th one, man, you can't help but worship and praise God and thank him. So next week will be week 4. We're going to go from Joshua to Malachi. We're going to finish the Old Testament. It's going to be super nerdy. If you like charts and timelines, tune in next week. And then in 2 weeks, week 5, we're going to tie it all together. And I think you'll be glad that you stuck it through. Thank you guys so much for tuning in.